Thank you very much, Dr. Caldamone. Thank you, Dr. Dr. Lorenzo, and thank you, Dr. Nelson. What a great session. It is with distinction that I serendipitously was given this opportunity to present the 2020 Meredith Campbell Lecturer when Dr. Ritchie was unable to make it today. And I think that anyone who would be given this opportunity would feel a special fondness for our next speaker. He has touched many of us in our lives, and I can't say enough about what a person of genuineness that he is. Dr. David Bloom earned his medical degree from the State University of New York at Buffalo in 1971. After serving an internship in surgery at UCLA, he completed dual residencies in surgery and urology, both at UCLA, in addition to a fellowship in pediatric urology at the Institute of Urology of the University of London. In 1980, Dr. Bloom was appointed assistant professor of surgery at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences and staff urologist at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. He was named chief of pediatric urology at Walter Reed in 1983, and not surprisingly, left the Army as a lieutenant colonel in 1984, where Dr. Bloom joined the University of Michigan faculty as chief of pediatric urology. In 2002, Dr. Bloom received the Jack Lapides Endowed Professorship in Urology and served as Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs of the University of Michigan Medical School from 2000 to 2007. In 2007, Dr. Bloom became chair of the Department of Urology and served in this capacity up until January of 2019. Dr. Bloom has held offices in 24 professional societies, including chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics section on urology. He served as historian for the Society for Pediatric Urology and secretary, treasurer, and president for the American Association of GU Surgeons. He has completed a 6-year term as trustee of the American Board of Urology, a 3-year term on the board of directors of the American Board of Medical Specialties, and a 6-year term as governor of the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Bloom's clinical and scholarly interests are wide-ranging and include genitourinary reconstruction, lower urinary tract dysfunction, genital anomalies, neurogenic bladder, laparoscopy, and of course, medical history. During his time at Michigan, he has published more than 165 papers and 69 book chapters. He's served on several editorial boards and, interestingly, has served as a consultant for Stedman's Medical Dictionary. I think that we can all agree that Dr. Bloom is a true historian and has a love for books. And I think that all of us know that he has a passion for photography. But I think what we all know is that he is a true Renaissance man, and I look forward to hearing his lecture. Thank you, Dr. Bloom.
Greetings, friends, and thank you for the privilege of giving this 57th Meredith Campbell lecture. We were supposed to be meeting in Washington, D.C., but a virus got in the way. The AUA has been canceled only 4 other times since 1902, when it first met in Saratoga Springs, New York. The world is unpredictable, geopolitically, economically, and environmentally. This was how it looked to Hieronymus Bosch 500 years ago before social distancing. Today, we live at a hinge moment in time, forced by a disturbance of public health. Today, we need to find balance in the beautiful moments, daily routines, and even in the dark situations. But now, let's turn to some orderly matters of history and ideas. Ideas are like viruses, bits of information that may or may not insert themselves into the genome and epigenome of our culture. We humans have lots of ideas and reach many conclusions that we believe in and like to spread to others. Most ideas are transient and vanish quickly. Some endure and become woven into the fabric of life. Richard Dawkins called those ones memes. Some memes are terrible. Others are good ideas that become generalizable and accepted by society. These become dogma, rules, and conventions. Occasional ideas are truths as determined by testing, criticism, and experiment. For example, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Ideas that are very robust become complete fields of study and work, like pediatric urology. My claim is that the Meredith Campbell lecture celebrates the legitimacy of our relatively new branch of surgery. Pediatric urology was complete as a field by 1964 epistemologically, with a cadre of practitioners, educators, and investigators. Those people took a practice of dogma and empiricism to a new domain based on science and technology, as seen in these lectures. Now, what I've briefly sketched in broad outline, let me tell again in more detail in the coming slides. This is what you might call the episteme of humanity. We have figured out a lot of very good ideas and developed skills that would look magical to our ancestors. Our brains, built literally of stardust, have imagined and created far more information in terms of ideas than atoms in the universe in raw numbers, if you consider just the Shannon number. Subspecialization is a fact of human civilization. No one can declare a limit to it. So, where did pediatric urology actually begin? On the left? First of all, circumcision is sometimes necessary. Consider phimosis, paraphimosis, and posthitis. The lowly circ has solved clinical problems for most of human history and became translated into routine and ritual by many cultures. Circumcision is not equivalent to female genital mutilation. We must guard against this recent political weaponization. Galenic lithotomy might alternatively be claimed as an origin for our field, and consider the name John Hunter. Hunter's ideas and work could be considered a starting point, but he didn't create pediatric urology as a complete field of knowledge and practice. Much more was necessary. What conditions constitute a new branch of surgery? A distinct skill set, a body of knowledge with technologies verified by peer review and open criticism. B, recognized practitioners, educators, and investigators. And C, socialization and free speech. Please notice the underlying role of personal liberty in thought, speech, publication, and assembly. Children's hospitals were a necessary condition. They began in London at Great Ormond Street Hospital and in this country in Philadelphia. So too were identification and solutions to problems in the field, anomalies such as hypospadias and undescended testis. Innovative technology was essential, electricity and fine instruments, particularly cystoscopes. Then Meredith Campbell showed up just as the world was changing after the Great War, influenza pandemic, and depression. Campbell came from Wisconsin. He trained and worked in New York City and caught TB like so many of his era. He defined the pediatric urology clinical domain in his foundational book of 1937. His 2-volume book was the first and only complete text on the topic, and it became the working Bible for anyone trying to figure out pediatric urology over the next 20 years. The first pediatric urology job was Dutch. In Holland on July 11, 1947, Nicholas Baker became consulting urologist at Juliana Children's Hospital in The Hague, Netherlands. He depended totally on the 1937 Campbell text at first, but soon turned to a young man in London who started to figure out pediatric urology condition by condition, and this was D.I. Williams. We'll come back to him shortly. With Campbell's book in 1937 and Baker's first pediatric urology physician in 1947, two of the three conditions were present for a new branch of surgery. The skill set was in its early stages, and a few practitioners were engaged in education, study, and practice, but societies, meetings, and robust collaborations were lacking. That began to change the following year in 1948. Frank Bicknell of Detroit and Harry Spence of Dallas, in a taxicab conversation at the 1948 AUA annual meeting in Boston, discussed forming a Society for Pediatric Urology. That same year, inspired by a sad case of posterior urethral valves, that young surgeon in London, David Innes Williams, decided to focus his career on pediatric urology. Word spread and Nico Baker came to visit. David Innes Williams realized none of his teachers had a clue how to manage a child with urethral valves. He resolved to direct his career towards that empty niche. Here's how he recounted it, quote, "It was in 1948 when, after 6 years of general surgery, in and out of the Army, I was a resident in urology at St. Peter's Hospital for Stone, that I realized that the senior staff there had no idea how to treat a boy admitted with retention from posterior urethral valves." The only major text on the subject was then Meredith Campbell's 2 volumes, published in 1937, but that was rather too heavily dependent on autopsy material from the Bellevue Hospital, New York. I then obtained an attachment at Great Ormond Street to the delightful Mr. Thomas Twistington Higgins, a general surgeon with an inclination towards urology, and assisted him in the publication of the Urology of Childhood in 1951. That book came out the same year as did the second edition of Campbell, now in a single volume. That same year, the SPU convened its first meeting. It was at Chicago's Palmer House Hotel. That was a small chance meeting, Bicknell recalled. Of course, other things were happening in the world: the heart-lung machine, color TV, and the Korean War, and the redoubtable film The African Queen with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn, daughter of a Connecticut urologist. In 1952, D.I. Williams was appointed senior genitourinary surgeon at Great Ormond Street Hospital. He later wrote, "Pediatric urology was launched, but still had to claim its territory, gain its corpus of in-depth knowledge, and develop its defining skills." France was the next stop for pediatric urology when a young resident, Jean Sandron, obtained a Fulbright scholarship to study in Boston with pediatric surgeons Robert Gross and Orvar Swenson. Sandron then visited ACMI, American Cystoscope Makers Incorporated in New York, to learn about cystoscopy, and on return to Paris, he became an assistant de gymnastique, a physical therapy title that allowed him to do pediatric urology work. He then collaborated across the channel with D.I. Williams. Ireland was next with the incomparable Barry O'Donnell, an early disciple of D.I. Williams. Barry raised the level of Ireland's urologic care after study at Great Ormond Street and then in Boston. Sadly, he passed away last year. Pediatric urology came to Canada in 1957 after Bob Jeff studied in London with D.I. Williams. Jeff left a huge legacy in Toronto and then created another one in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. And you might look at Marty Coyle's paper in the Canadian Urologic Association Journal in just this past May. Herbie Johnston, back in England, was the next titan in our emerging field in 1958. His institution developed modern pediatric anesthesia and showed the world that pediatric intubation was feasible and safe. The Liverpool technique allowed longer and more daring pediatric surgical procedures. At Alder Hey, Herbie's colleague Peter Rickham astonished the world with the first surviving cloacal exstrophy closure. Our late friend Gordon McClory recalled this comment from C. Everett Koop that pediatric endotracheal anesthesia was, quote, the critical intervention that allowed pediatric urology to transition from brief mask, diagnostic, and short-range interventions to extensive reconstructions under long but safe anesthesia, end quote. This brings us to another bit of socialization, the formation of the section on urology in the American Academy of Pediatrics. Here again, we find the hand of Frank Bicknell, whose son-in-law was president-elect of the AAP. In July of 1959, Bicknell wrote enthusiastically to John Latimer about forming a section on pediatric urology within the AAP. The first AAP urology meeting was held October 18th in Chicago, 1960. Again at the Palmer House. The topics were cryptorchidism and pediatric urological emergencies. Urology in the AAP actually began as a committee with John Latimer as its chair for the first 9 years, and in 1971 the committee became a section. I'd like to pause for a moment of tribute to Ed Tank, AAP Section on Urology Chair, 1990 through 91, who passed away last month at age 88 in Oregon. And let's also say goodbye to another giant, Howard Snyder, who died just this past month in Philadelphia. In Boston in 1960, W. Hardy Hendren brought pediatric urology to the Mass General Hospital, later moving back to Children's Hospital. Hardy, against the tide of flat earth believers, figured out much of major pediatric urology reconstruction and taught generations of disciples. In Chicago in the summer of 1963, a young Hopkins trainee named Lowell King went to Northwestern as the first full-time pediatric urologist in the U.S. While there, he trained George Kaplan, Ken Kropp, Barry Bellman, Marty Dresner, and Phil Nasrella for a start. Lowell would have a brilliant second career at Duke, where he inspired another great cohort of pediatric urologists. In England, where it all started, the scale was smaller, but the few workers in pediatric surgery and pediatric urology craved some sort of ritualized dialogue. So in 1963, D.I. Williams got, quote, a group of us together over the dinner table to found the Society of Pediatric Urological Surgeons, a somewhat relaxed affair which would have been called a club, but for the fact that expenses were only deductible for societies, end quote. So now pediatric urology had the SPU and the AUA, the Committee on Urology in the AAP, and SPUS with pediatric surgeons in Europe. With all three conditions fulfilled, pediatric urology could be claimed as a legitimate branch of surgery. These three amino acids built the novel protein of pediatric urology, if you will. Another milestone occurred in 1963 when a young graduate of the Cornell Urology program, John Woodard, became the first American registrar or resident to serve with David Innes Williams. We've figured out a lot of stuff since our earliest days and created a suite of skills, knowledge, and tools. Subspecialization is a fact of human civilization, and pediatric urology was completely here by 1964. And what better way to show and celebrate this than an annual lecture? Harry Spence had that idea, and the Meredith Campbell Lecture was initiated at the AUA in 1964. The speaker and topic should be no surprise to you now, but I can't look up and call on anyone, so I'll have to tell you. The speaker was David Innes Williams, and the topic was posterior urethral valves. Here from left to right, you see two other great founders of pediatric urology, Alan Reddick and John Duckett, with D.I. Williams. Campbell Lectures 1 through 8 began with valves and covered its main conditions, including enuresis, Wilms tumor twice, UTIs, exstrophy, and hermaphrodites. And let's briefly explore this time interval of 1964 through 71. Peds urology in these years grew explosively with new American practices at Mayo with Panis Kalalis, shown here, at Columbia, the first fellowship, at Yale, Einstein, San Diego, CHOP, Gainesville, Emory, Toledo, Dallas, Detroit, and UCLA, where I was a surgical intern in 1971. In fact, it was from UCLA that the 1971 Campbell Lecture came, when Willard Goodwin gave its 8th version with maybe the best title ever: Some Hermaphrodites, Pseudo-Hermaphrodites, Ambisexuals, and Other Ambiguous Types I Have Known. And on the left, you see Goodwin and his trainee and successor, Joe Kaufman. Also, coincidentally, at that 1971 AUA in Chicago was Jack Lapidus, whose name I now carry with an endowed professorship. Jack moderated a session called What Makes a Good Urology Residency, and notice the panelists. 6 weeks after that AUA, I began surgical internship at UCLA, and it turned out to be a great place to learn surgery and urology. I was a clueless general surgery intern and resident back then, and started hearing about things like pediatric urology, Wilms tumor, vesicoureteral reflux, and bladder exstrophy. Dogma served me well at first. It helped me get a handle on surgery and urology as a resident, but it wouldn't be enough for a lifetime in practice and teaching. Things would change. Change was reflected in the next Meredith Campbell lectures, numbers 9 through 16, 3 on epispadias exstrophy, topics still in contention. Douglas Stevens and Blackwell Evans on structure and function, sexual development, radiology, and Meredith Campbell himself by Lowell King. Lectures 17 through 24 were a mix of the old and the new: uroradiology twice, endocrinology, rhabdomyosarcoma, neurogenic bladder, renal disease, and basic science. In these lectures, dogmas were replaced by verifiable information, tested in the free markets of thought and practice, as audiences like you listened carefully. Now on the internet, anyone can listen anywhere, dressed in all sorts of ways, or not. With Meredith Campbell lectures 25 through 32, new information kept coming relentlessly. From Beckwith, Horton, and Coop through Hendren, Allen, and Duckett came reflections, strategies, and panoramas. We recall John Duckett especially fondly, shown here with his successor, Doug Canning. Meredith Campbell lectures 33 through 39 were wide-ranging as the 20th century was ending. I well recall Philip Ransley's 1996 talk on antenatal hydronephrosis and Mike Harrison's on interventions. Pat Donahoe on Mullerian issues, then geomedicine, Einstein, and welfare fraud as the 21st century began. Meredith Campbell lectures 40 through 47 covered personal perspectives and concerns like negotiation, courage, and burnout, or universal health care, aging, trauma, and transitional urology, with speakers from Jim Mandel to Chris Woodhouse. Here's Mandel on the left at Boston Children's Hospital, the 40th lecturer, with Woodhouse and Douglas Stevens, 47th and 10th Meredith Campbell lecturers on the right. Campbell lectures 48 through 53 attended to the Affordable Care Act, Steve Koff and the enduring mysteries of the UPJ, embryology, new concerns such as the effect of anesthesia on the developing brain, and mentoring from Larry Baskin. I also want to thank Tupper Stevens and Julian Wan for helping compile this list. Mentoring came up again the next year with Jack McInich, and truly we can't say too much about mentoring. Philip Ransley, Meredith Campbell lecturer of 1996, returned to the podium, the only repeat, in 2018. And Alberto Pino was here last year with personal reflections of his career and great surgical innovations. In preparation for this, I discovered that Alberto got turned on to pediatric surgery in 1963 during a visit to Ann Arbor as a medical student from Mexico when he saw Cameron Haight fix 2 tracheoesophageal fistulas. Content analysis is tricky. The wide-ranging topics prove difficult to categorize. I tried several times. Here's one: accounting. I came to see that pediatric urology encompasses curiosity, art, science, and the humanity of healthcare as well as any medical specialty. Maybe pediatric urology is not unique in this, but it certainly offers great opportunity to excel in these best traits of humanity: art, science, and human kindness. To conclude, pediatric urology was born with Meredith Campbell's book in 1937. Adulthood came in 1964 with the lecture named for him. Through these lectures, we've learned that clinical topics are temporal, although some questions continue to nag. Personality matters in education, practice, and science, and pediatric urology, as we all know, is rich in personalities. Ultimately, technology changes everything. A final comment: human disorders, comorbidities, social determinants, and technology change rapidly. They combine to produce great complexity in patients, their families, and for ourselves, the healthcare providers. All this complexity makes algorithmic solutions to clinical problems a fool's errand. The practice of medicine remains an art to be perfected, patient by patient, patiently and thoughtfully, using the tools of the day, including algorithms, but not in total service to those tools. Thank you for the privilege of giving this 57th Meredith Campbell lecture.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bloom. Really appreciate that fabulous talk. You covered so much history of pediatric urology. And while people are getting ready to ask questions, I'd like to start off. I will remind people to click the little blue button in the lower portion of your screen that says Ask, and that will help get your question to me. But to prepare for today, I did bring my copy of my book, the Twistington-Higgins book with Mr. Williams and Mr. Nash that Edmund Gonzalez had given me a few months ago. And I wanted to ask you a question that may be difficult, but I'd like to just pick your brain a little bit and ask you, what do you feel has been one of the most critical or important sentinel events or contributions that has really defined or perhaps elevated pediatric urology?
Well, first, thank you for this has been a great program, Tony and Louis, and I'm sorry, Mike Ritchie's not here. I talked to him yesterday, and he said he's getting his voice back from his COVID episode. What really triggered pediatric urology? Certainly the posterior urethral valves that inspired D.I. Williams was one triggering event, although it might have been, in his opinion, he said reflux was a key problem that was really the inspiration for fueling the explosion of the field. But I think it was a lot of problems that kids had when enough people that were pediatric urologists could coalesce, combine their observations and their skills, and legitimately fix problems better than any other group of people could, whether it was undescended testis, urethral valves, hypospadias, exstrophy, which is still in evolution as we saw today in this great program, or the UPJ obstruction, as Caleb was just talking about, one of the enduring problems that nags us. But I think many things kind of conspired to give us as a group of people the opportunity to do things better than any other cohort. So I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you, but we can debate that over a course sometime.
So another book that I was reading in preparation today was the Hinman History of American Pediatric Urology. And I wanted to get your thoughts about the transition of the SPU from a, quote, splinter group of the AUA from 1951 until it was formally included with a page in the 1965 AUA program entitled Society for Pediatric Urology. And then similarly, I'd like to get your thoughts about how you might relate to a more contemporary transition of the establishments of the Societies of Pediatric Urology, their independent fall Congress, and just how we've kind of transitioned from splinter group to now where we are today.
Well, the splinter group really began when a number of adult urologists started to emphasize pediatric conditions. And that first meeting of the SPU was just 8 people. But within a few years, they had overflow audiences when they were expecting not even 100 and 1,000 people showed up. So as we showed in the previous slides, by 1964, we were legitimately a group. But it was the AUA that fostered the environment for the SPU. And it was kind of a contentious one at first. And the meetings, as I read in Frank Hinman's book, were the day before the AUA and then maybe mentioned on the program and maybe sanctioned by the AUA and not sanctioned another year. And it was really under Bill Turner, when he was the president of the AUA, that he kind of brought the SPU back into the fold of the AUA and legitimized it in the program, as we sort of are in this hybrid virtual session. The second group, the AAP, was very important from the point of building our alliance